The bazooka tube is ice cold against his cheek, the smell of metal mixing with old gunpowder. At just over 50 meters, our Panzer 4 crawls forward, its 80mm front armor having treated bazookas like toys until now. The young soldier takes a short breath, peers through the crude sight, and wonders if he's just shouldered his lifeline, or another useless iron pipe. The controversy sits right there. For the early years of the war, the United States Army kept sending men into battle with an anti-tank weapon everyone knew missed more often than it hit. Then, on one freezing morning at Aberdeen in 1943, a small change to the rifling inside that launch tube turned the bazooka from roughly 15% odds of killing a tank into almost 97% against the front armor of a Panzer IV. The difference between a suicide shot and a near-certain kill. How could a few thin, spiraled grooves, cut into the steel inside the tube, make the rocket fly straighter, punch in almost twice as deep, more than 8 inches of solid armor, and save the lives of thousands of infantrymen? The story begins in the instant the soldier squeezes the trigger, and the entire United States Army is forced to admit that, up to that moment, physics has not been on their side. Before that cold steel tube ever touched a soldier's cheek, the battlefields of Europe were playgrounds for 20 to 30-ton blocks of armor bearing black crosses, Panzer III, Panzer IV, with front armor 50 to 80 millimeters thick, rolled across open fields, their tracks grinding trenches flat, while American infantry were almost empty-handed. Rifles and light machine guns did little more than scratch paint. The boys' anti-tank rifle or 37mm armor-piercing rounds could on paper punch through a bit more than 20mm of steel at 100 yards. But that was in test ranges, under clean conditions, before dust, mud, a racing heartbeat, and the roar of engines got involved. The High Command understood this physics problem very clearly. They needed a weapon that a bare-shouldered infantryman weighing under 70 kilograms could carry, fire from his shoulder, and still tear through at least 80 millimeters of homogeneous armor, the standard for a Panzer IV. That is how the Monet bazooka was born. A 2.36-inch launch tube firing a rocket with a shaped charge warhead. In theory, the jet from that warhead could bite through more than 4 inches of steel, if the round arrived in exactly the right attitude, near perpendicular, and detonated at the correct standoff. The entire problem was hidden in that if the tube was made smooth inside for ease of production, the rocket relied on tail fins, and outside the training range it behaved like an expensive firework. Sometimes it hit, sometimes it corkscrewed in flight and struck the armor at a bad angle, turning the shaped charge into a second-rate high-explosive burst. Behind every wild round was a chain of very ordinary constraints. Production lines already set up, machines already paid for, contracts for steel, propellant, wiring already signed. By early 1943, the United States had built around 14,000 Moan launchers. Roughly 8,000 still in America could be given rifling, and about 6,000 already at the front would need field upgrade kits. The rifled M1A1 and M9 began reaching combat in Tunisia in 1943, and then in Sicily, Anzio, Normandy, and the Bulge. Telling everyone stop and start over at that point would have meant frontline units going for entire months with nothing on their shoulders but faith. At Aberdeen, where every new idea had to pass through a gun barrel and a spreadsheet, artillery engineers were squeezed between 2 sets of armor plates. On one side were reports from the front troops complaining that bazookas missed, failed to penetrate, forced them to sneak around and hit tank flanks at grenade range. On the other side was logistics reality. Every change to the launch tube meant new tooling, new workers, more retraining time. By the production office's math, just running each bazooka tube through a massive rifling machine would cost about 8 minutes of machine time and $12, not counting inspection, with tens of thousands of tubes that ballooned into a mountain of money and weeks of delay. Here lay the original paradox. The United States Army had a weapon that was right in concept: light, compact, with a strong enough warhead, yet chose to let it operate at roughly 15% odds of killing its main target at the front, simply because switching to a better version would scramble production charts. The battlefield, however, refused to wait. In Tunisia, after-action reports showed German tanks still slicing through infantry formations like a hot knife through butter. Bazookas showed up in propaganda photos far more often than in lists of enemy armor destroyed. Behind closed doors, logistics officers counted every ton of steel and every container of propellant. Training officers worried about the time to teach hundreds of thousands of recruits how to shoot a revised weapon. And ordnance engineers held test sheets that pointed to an uncomfortable truth: the smooth tube was the bottleneck, not the warhead, not the soldiers. But each group was pulled into its own frame of reference. Some stared at monthly output charts, others at campaign maps, and very few looked directly at the 50 meters between a bazooka and a Panzer crawling toward it. It was in that context, inside a system extremely good at mass production but bad at accepting line disruption, that an idea sounding both crude and reckless was laid on the table: cut thin spiral grooves into the inside of the launch tube, force the rocket to spin like a bullet, instead of praying to those tail fins. The man who proposed it knew that if it failed, he would be remembered as the one who wrecked the United States Army's bazooka program. But if it worked, every minute of machine time, every $12, every 8 minutes on that rifling rig would translate directly into survival odds for the men lying flat in the dirt in front of 75mm gun barrels. And to find out whether the idea was genius or madness, it first had to leave the conference room and step out onto a frozen test range on a January morning in 1943. The first decisive factor looked like dry, boring engineering, but it sat right on the line between life and death: the rocket's flight path, and the way the shaped charge warhead met the armor. The original Monet bazooka was basically a guided firework. The rocket was kept more or less on course by a few tail fins, and the launch tube was smooth. On a quiet training range, at 30 to 40 meters, that seemed acceptable. Out on a real battlefield, with crosswinds, smoke, dust, shaking hands, and a soldier gasping for air, the fireworks showed its true colors. Some rounds flew straight. Others started wobbling the moment they cleared the tube, fishtailing and smacking into armor at ugly angles, knocking the shaped charge jet off-center and bleeding away penetration in an instant. With a shaped charge warhead, geometry is almost everything. To punch through 80 to 100 millimeters of armor, the superplastic metal jet formed in the cone has to run straight, as close to perpendicular to the armor as possible, and the warhead has to detonate at the standoff distance it was designed for. If it hits at a slant or starts to yaw just before detonation, effectiveness drops off as fast as yanking a handbrake on a downhill slope. What Mohaupt saw, what many officers preferred not to see, was this: the problem was not the explosive, not the cone, but the 50 meters of air the rocket had to cross before it ever touched the tank. His solution was so simple it bordered on heresy. Treat the rocket like an oversized bullet, make it spin, cut spiral grooves into the inside of the launch tube, let the rocket engage them with a thin metal band, and when the propellant burned, the gases would not only shove the rocket forward, they would spin it up to thousands of revolutions per minute. Gyroscopic stability would hold the rocket's axis steady in flight, like a toy top, only at supersonic speed. On paper, it was beautiful. In practice, nobody wanted to stake an entire industrial program on a theory. At Aberdeen, Mohaupt finally got what he needed: 2 launch tubes, one smooth and one rifled, a batch of identical rockets, a real slab of Panzer IV armor, several plates of steel 4, 6, and 8 inches thick, and a row of high-speed cameras. That freezing morning was not just a live-fire demo. It was a courtroom where physics, money, and habit had to argue it out. The first strings of shots through the smooth tube produced the same old picture at 50 yards. A fair percentage of rockets wandered off the center of the target, and some struck the armor at such bad angles that the shaped charge behaved like a mediocre high-explosive shell. Measured penetration hovered around 4 inches, sometimes worse. When the rifled tube went up on the stand, the engineers didn't need to wait for the tape measure to know something had changed. On slow motion, you could see the rocket leaving the muzzle like a drawn arrow, straight line, steady spin, noticeably less wobble. On the armor plates, impact marks crowded closer to center, and the holes were round and clean, classic signatures of a stable, straight-running yet. When they finally took measurements, the rifled tube produced the numbers. Everyone would later quote, consistent penetration above 7.5 inches, with some strings nudging past 8 inches of homogeneous steel, while dispersion shrank and hit probability at 50 yards, climbed to 100% in that test series. The irony is that spin itself doesn't make a shaped charge stronger in a pure physics sense. In fact, spin it too fast and you can tear the jet apart. What Mohaupt was gambling on was a narrow sweet spot, enough spin to stabilize the rocket and slam it into the plate in the right attitude, but not so much that it destroyed the jet formation. He chose a moderate twist rate, reworked the rocket structure to survive the torque, and staked his reputation on that band of velocities. When the first results came off the printer, the whole test bay went quiet for a few seconds. The new penetration curve didn't just sit higher, it ran flatter, with less scatter, the kind of curve every engineer instinctively reads as trustworthy. For the infantryman up front, all those numbers boiled down into a brutally simple feeling, where squeezing a bazooka trigger used to be like buying a lottery ticket with 15% odds. Now it felt like a near sure thing. At the tactical level, that meant a squad could dare to face a Panzer IV head-on inside 50 to 75 meters, instead of only taking shots at its flank and always in ambush. At the technical level, it proved something logistics officers hated to admit. The smooth launch tube was wasting the potential of the entire shaped charge system, and every tube that went across the rifling machine was one more human life pulled back from the edge. But physics had only won half the battle. The other half lived on paper. How those cold figures from Aberdeen were supposed to punch through the thick armor of habit, bureaucracy, and frozen production schedules. That was when the horse trading, the hallway handshakes, and the quiet fear of German tanks on campaign maps began to speak up. The second decisive factor sat in a place nobody likes to talk about. Frontline reports, thick memos, and egos drifting up and down Pentagon hallways. It was no accident that the idea of cutting rifling into the launch tube appeared just as maps of Europe were filling up with Panzer IVs and the first whispers of Tiger I tanks with 100 millimeters of frontal armor from Tunisia to the Eastern Front. Liaison officers sent back lines that looked calm on paper, but reeked of quiet panic. Current man-portable anti-tank weapons are unreliable at combat ranges. Bazooka teams must seek flank shots, avoid direct frontal engagements, rounds striking off-angle, warheads failing to achieve full penetration. Said less politely, the troops felt like they were carrying lottery tickets, not weapons. At the other end of the phone line, artillery and logistics generals had to translate that language into numbers and charts. Intelligence on German armor was getting clearer. Upgraded Panzer IVs, Tigers and Panthers coming into service. Frontal armor thickness climbing faster than many field guns were improving. Without a truly sharp dagger in infantry hands, the whole new doctrine of mobile warfare infantry, tanks, and self-propelled guns working together risked turning into a game of running circles around German steel. In that picture, the bazooka was a strategic promise. A single soldier with a tube on his shoulder could pin down a tank worth tens of thousands of dollars long enough for artillery and aircraft to finish it. The problem was that every dispatch from the front kept scribbling a cross over that promise. Supply chains and internal politics, as usual, did not enjoy being told they were the problem. Production departments had their own scoreboard. Lines, meeting or beating quota. Moan launchers rolling out on time. Low defect rates. Contractors, happy. In the conference room, Success was measured with monthly output graphs, not with the 50 meters between a soldier and a tank. A change that sounded simple, running tubes through a rifling machine, was their nightmare, shutting down lines, resetting tools, retraining workers, redoing inspections, renegotiating contracts. Everyone understood that if they did it, the number of bazookas shipped might dip for weeks, and no general wanted his name under a campaign map with a neat red notice, short on man-portable anti-tank weapons, right before a major offensive. In that ecosystem, Mohaupt was not just firing at Panzer armor. He was firing at a carefully layered power structure. The first Aberdeen reports landed on a technical chief's desk, then moved into the hands of General Barnes, head of the Ordnance Department, one of the few men who understood enough engineering and enough politics to see the opening. In the 7-plus-inch penetration figures and the near 100% hit rate at 50 yards, Barnes saw something bureaucracies hate, a perfectly good reason to stop and change course. Even he could not simply slam his fist on the table and say, "From tomorrow on, rifle everything." Contractors would ask who paid for the extra machine hours. Logistics officers would demand proof it was not just a lucky test. Other branches would quietly mutter, "If the new bazooka is so good, why are we only hearing about it now?" Here is where intelligence became political leverage. Letters from Tunisia, after-action reports, photographs of German tanks pushing through infantry lines that supposedly had bazookas formed an unofficial indictment. When a frontline officer wrote that bazooka teams were forced to crawl around for flank shots into machine gun arcs because they did not trust a frontal hit, he was, without meaning to, signing the rifling request more powerfully than any engineer. Barnes and a handful of allies gathered these fragments, laid them alongside the Aberdeen charts, and drew a picture that could not be brushed aside. Unless they accepted a temporary production slowdown, they would keep sending men into battle with weapons running at 15% of their real potential. Under that pressure, the supply chain began to turn. They recalculated there were still roughly 8,000 Mohn tubes in stateside depots. Those could be rifled first and shipped to units headed for Italy and Western Europe, while a simpler upgrade kit went to the 6,000 or so launchers already overseas. Factories were told to bolt rifling into existing workflows instead of tearing everything up some combined deep drilling machines with new spiral cutters, swallowing the extra $12 a tube and 8 minutes of machine time. In return, tactical forecasts projected a several-fold increase in tank kill probability, a profit measured in survival odds even the coldest bookkeeper could not entirely ignore. Internal politics, like any office war, still needed champions and shield-bearers. Mohaupt was only an engineer, nowhere near high enough on the ladder to win shouting matches in big briefings. Barnes was the man whose name would stand in front of the War Department, but he needed allies in neighboring bureaus, so he would not look like the maverick who broke process. A lot of persuasion happened off the record, in corridors, on golf courses, over dinners, where generals and contractors joked half-seriously about the tiger monster and how American troops could not keep chasing tanks with nothing but rifles. Some people were convinced by the physics. Others simply did not want to be the ones blamed if bazookas kept failing. Frontline intelligence, factory schedules, and bruised egos all twisted together like the grooves inside that launch tube. The end result was a decision that looked purely technical on paper. Rifle, all new bazooka tubes, ship upgrade kits for those already in theatre, and prioritize the units most likely to face heavy German armor. Physics had proven its case on the test range. Politics, for the moment, stepped back a pace. Only when the first rifled launchers sailed out to the war did anyone really know whether all that backroom maneuvering would buy the only thing that mattered. A better chance for a 3-man team crawling through mud to stay alive when a Panzer dropped its gun barrel in their direction. The Italian winter air was damp and heavy, with the stink of burning fuel. Sergeant Miller slid the new bazooka off his shoulder and laid it along the wet embankment, his hand still not quite used to the cold. Fine grooves hidden inside the tube. Feels just like the old one to me. Loader Jenkins grumbled, his voice swallowed by the crash of German 75mm shells pounding the hillside ahead. Miller didn't answer. He just peered through a gap in the vineyard, where a block of steel with black crosses a Panzer IV was slowly depressing its gun, front armor slick with mud. They had fired at that kind of tank before with smoothbore tubes, had watched rockets veer off, heard that hollow clang on armor, then crawled backward under a rain of fire. This time, it started with the way it sat on his shoulder. The launcher was a bit heavier, thanks to the metal cut out inside, but it balanced better. The stock biting firmly into his collarbone, Jenkins shoved the rocket in. The thin metal band kissed the rifling with a dry little scrape that only someone holding his breath would hear. Miller raised the tube, the smell of fresh paint and cut steel still clinging to it. The distance to the tank was roughly 60 meters in the manual. That was ideal range, but to someone who had watched shots miss, it felt more like the space between where he lay and a gravestone with his name on it. Up. Jenkins tapped his leg. Miller's shoulder tightened. His cheek settled against the tube. Eye locked to the crude sight, a ring and a post. Nothing fancy. In his view, the world shrank down to that 80mm plate on the Panzer's nose, and the strip of air 50 to 60 meters wide between them. He heard the training officer in his head. The new rockets fly straighter. Don't overcorrect. Just hold center. The doubting part of his brain muttered back. They said that last time too. The launch did not feel like a rifle shot. It was more of a shove than a kick. A blast of dry heat snapping past his back, kicking dust up under his heels. In that sliver of a second, all Miller registered was the weight lifting off his shoulder, the sour smell of old propellant, and a long whoosh with a thin, high whistle as the rocket rode out. Before, he always tried to guess the trajectory. Will it wobble? Will it nose down? Will the wind grab it? This time he never got the chance. In the span of a single heartbeat, the tiny green dot on the rocket's nose streaked straight ahead as if someone were dragging it on a wire. The impact did not ring out with a hollow clang like a failed armor-piercing hit. It was a compressed thump, followed by the tearing shriek of metal. Orange fire burst sideways along the tank's flank. A thin grey jet of smoke punched out from the center of the front plate, then instantly swelled into a thick black column. Miller saw the chunk of armor blown free, the edges of the hole biting deep into the steel hull, sharp and clean, as if carved by some gigantic drill bit. The Panzer lurched to a stop in the vineyard, gun barrels sagging uselessly. Someone behind him shouted something about punching clean through 8 inches of steel, but Miller's ears were full of the sound of the engine choking out. The first feeling was not joy. It was emptiness. He was so used to pulling the trigger and waiting for disappointment that when the rocket finally behaved exactly the way the manual had promised, his brain needed half a second to catch up. Then the adrenaline crashed in. They had just faced a Panzer IV at 60 meters, head-on, without sneaking around to the flank, and the tank never got a second chance. For anyone who had lived through the smoothbore bazooka days, this was more than a successful hit. It was the rules of the game being torn up right in front of them. Shouts and ragged laughter exploded in the foxhole. Jenkins hammered a fist into Miller's back, and the rifleman beside them, who had been firing, covering shots, swore like someone who had just realized he'd been cheated for years. If you'd given me this back in Tunisia, I wouldn't have had to run like a dog behind those damn tin cans. Under the chaos, our guns, their guns, the clatter of other tank tracks trying to turn, Miller could still hear the bazooka tube rolling on the dirt. The rifling inside, now filmed with black soot. It was physical proof that the rocket had not flown by luck this time, but on the back of a new kind of stability. At squad level, the turning point was brutally simple. From now on, bazooka teams were no longer the guys with the expensive fireworks. Ambush plans were redrawn. Instead of always hunting for side shots, they could claim frontal kill zones, places where a Panzer had to show its nose coming over a bridge or through a village gate. Instead of saving bazooka rounds for perfect chances, they started mapping every narrow stretch of road so that at least one team could cover it within 50 to 75 meters. One shot, one tank, the kill ratio now pushed close to 1-to-1 at those distances. The kind of math that used to live only on engineers' briefing slides. In the body, the biggest change was in the heartbeat. Bazooka crews no longer walked into battle feeling like they were carrying toys. On their shoulders was a promise that had already come true in a muddy Italian vineyard. A jet of metal fierce enough to chew through 8 inches of steel was no longer some distant number in an Aberdeen report. It was something they had seen with their own eyes. And once infantrymen understood they could stop a 20 to 30-ton tank with a single squeeze of the trigger, the battlefield around them, the low stone walls, the bends in the road, the little bridges turned into a chessboard where they finally had a piece that could call check. But every turning point has a flip side. If one bazooka team could do that to a Panzer IV on a grey Italian morning, then German officers from the platoon leaders up to the staff planners would very quickly realize American infantry were done firing fireworks. And once your enemy understands you now carry a real dagger, he starts learning how to fight the blade and twist the campaign around it, opening a new phase of steel storm, where each side tries to ratchet up armor and firepower one notch further. From the vineyards of Italy, the effect spread like a wave of steel. Trains loaded with weapons rolled out of the American East Coast, bazooka tubes with rifled interiors stacked like construction piping. The dry numbers in the ledgers, about 8 minutes of machine time and $12 added to each tube, suddenly turned into something very concrete at the front. Every company was issued a few more bazooka teams that officers trusted enough to mark directly onto their defensive diagrams, no longer treating them as secondary weapons. In after-action reports, new phrases started to appear. Pinning enemy tanks at 50 to 75 meters, killing vehicles with the first volley. The whole rhythm of fighting around those armored beasts shifted the way a football season changes when the underdog team discovers a kicker who can nail deep field goals in the final seconds. Every playbook has to be rewritten, in Sicily and then Anzio. Rifled bazooka teams became the right-time firepower infantry had been waiting for. When a Tiger One with 100 millimeters of frontal armor loomed out of the morning fog, nobody dreamed of punching straight through its face from long range, but they knew its flanks, rear, and weak spots around the turret ring were still fair game. A squad with 2 bazooka teams could now set up like fencers. Rifles and machine guns baited the tank into swinging its turret, exposing a side, while rockets came knifing out of the side alleys. Each successful shot did more than burn a few dozen tons of steel. It burned away the old image of tanks as untouchable gods that had haunted infantry since 1939. On narrow roads, a single bazooka crew lying in wait turned every Panzer IV charge into a gamble. The Germans no longer held the upper hand in. The Germans, of course, did not stand still and let others shoot at their targets. Thin skirt-plates Schürzen began to appear along Panzer hulls, meant to disrupt the shaped charge jet before it struck the main armor. Tank crews were retrained on how to approach villages. Infantry had to sweep side alleys ahead, and they were warned to avoid choke points where a bazooka might be waiting inside 50 meters. In Normandy, where bocage hedgerows created endless blind corners, it turned into a cat-and-mouse game. Bazooka crews learned to read the sound of tracks on dirt roads, I guess the next turn, and set up to fire at ranges where they could practically smell the diesel exhaust. Every successful shot meant a 20 to 30-ton vehicle jammed sideways between hedges, sealing off the entire column behind it. To keep pace with that escalation, anti-tank firepower in infantry hands had to be thickened up. What had been a company-level asset climbed to battalion density, then to regimental. Tactical manuals were updated. Every key defensive position bridges, crossroads. The village exits had to have at least 1 pair of bazooka teams with crossing fields of fire, so that any tank entering a 50 to 75-meter killing corridor would be visible from 2 directions. Rockets were no longer hoarded for perfect targets. They were budgeted by flow. How many tubes per meter of front? How many volleys per hour? The way artillerymen counted incoming and outgoing shells. At the operational level, American generals began talking about infantry armoring themselves with bazooka fire, instead of assuming friendly tanks would always be right beside them. From above, the map of Europe in the summer of 1944 to 1945 looked like a Formula One season where both sides kept upgrading engines mid-race. As soon as reports showed that the 2.36-inch bazooka was struggling against the newest, thicker armor layouts, designers were already sketching the 3.5-inch successor, what would later be called the Super Bazooka, carrying a warhead that could punch through somewhere beyond 10 inches of steel. Up front, bazooka crews still had to live in the present, a tube with rifling to keep the rocket honest, a warhead strong enough to make Panzer IVs, Stugs, even Panthers nervous at the right angles, and ammunition stocks no longer rationed as brutally as in the early months. On those steel storm days in Normandy or the Ardennes, each street corner, each hedgerow gap could become the spot where a three-man team decided the fate of an entire armoured thrust. You could measure this escalation not just by the number of burned-out tanks, but by the way people talked about them. In propaganda photos, the bazooka turned into an icon, a skinny soldier facing down a hulking block of armour, tube on his shoulder, rocket streaking off like an exclamation point across the frame. In training manuals, dry numbers, 80mm armour, 50-metre range. Optimal engagement angles sat lined up like equations. In the memories of the men who actually pulled the trigger, steel storm was something felt in aching shoulders, ringing ears, and the stink of burning rubber that clung for weeks after a battle. And as both sides kept shoving firepower and armour toward the edge of what physics would allow, one question hung in the air. When would the tightest moment come? That single point where a bazooka crew, a German tank, and a narrow stretch of road met deciding not just the fate of a squad, but the direction of an entire campaign. The small town on the edge of Normandy lay under a flat part-well, dirty kind of daylight, the kind you get on a heavy, overcast afternoon. Two-story stone houses pressed in along the main street, the paving stones scarred with track marks and burn spots. Sergeant Miller was flattened behind a first-floor windowsill, bazooka stretched across the ledge, his left palm resting exactly where he'd trained it to be, right over the point where the rifling inside the tube ended. Down in the street, between the rows of houses, the heavy, steady clank of tracks was drawing closer. So regular, it could have been used as a metronome. That's a Panther, not a Panzer IV, Jenkins rasped behind him. Miller didn't answer. He could feel every heartbeat thumping through the stock, into the soot-dark steel of the tube. They had hacked the window opening wider with bayonets and rifle butts, just enough room for the launcher and a sliver of view onto the street. From here, they saw exactly what the map had promised. A left-hand bend about 80 meters away, a broken brick wall, and a straight stretch of road where the tank would have to show its whole right flank if it wanted to push into the town centre. On paper, the job sounded simple. Wait for it to come out of the curve, let the hull clear, then hit the armour between the second and third road wheels. In reality, the mission broke down into much smaller tasks. Control your breathing, keep your head below the sill. Do not squeeze too early by even a single second. The track noise changed pitch as the Panther started into the turn. Miller couldn't see it yet, but he heard the drawn-out squeal of metal as the outer track took the load. The whole building shivered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, sprinkling his hot neck. Under his right index finger, the trigger was just a sliver of cold metal. So cold it felt like it was trying to keep him conscious. Let it come a bit more, he whispered, maybe to Jenkins, maybe to himself. Then the Panther's turret nose edged into view. Through the slit, Miller saw the square leading edge of the turret, the long 75mm gun jutting out like a giant pencil. It swept quickly across the row of houses opposite, fired around somewhere up the street. A house 3 doors down from them disappeared in a flash, windows blowing out, a scream cut off by falling masonry. Miller didn't move. He was waiting for the hull, the part he needed, not the gunhouse that was hunting for targets. The hull crawled out from behind the turret, piece by piece. its sloped armor plates appearing in his sight like steel puzzle tiles. The overlapping road wheels rose and fell over the uneven stones. The patch between the second and third wheel on the right side, the thinner armor over the fuel tanks, walked neatly into the center of the sight ring, as if someone had drawn it there beforehand. Miller could see dried mud cake on the plate, scars from old shrapnel, even a tiny flag whipping on the antenna at the back. After that, time flipped onto another scale, inside Miller's head. The second hand slowed so much he had room for entire memories. The frigid morning at Aberdeen, when someone fired the first test rockets through a rifled tube, the missed shot on a Panzer IV in Italy, that sickening hollow clang, the cold sweat crawling down his spine in the dark, but running straight through all that noise was one hard, bright line, the path from his cheek, through the sight ring, into that rectangle of armor between the second and third wheel, along with the steady, even weight of the bazooka on his shoulder. He squeezed the trigger. There was almost no kick, just a soft shove. But the backblast rattled what was left of the curtains, a sheet of hot, dry air slamming past his ear. The smell of propellant mingled with scorched plaster. The rocket leapt from the muzzle like a metal exclamation point, let out a thin scream, and shot into the narrow canyon of stone walls. Over a flight of not even 60 meters, it stayed rock-steady, spinning, drawing such a straight line that the human eye couldn't catch a single wobble. The hit was a clipped, hard clack smothered instantly by the warhead going off. In the frame of the little window, Miller saw a flash of white-blue pinned tight against the armor, then a tongue of orange fire blowing back out as if someone had opened a cutting torch inside the hull. A plate of armor not much bigger than a dinner dish flew free, cartwheeled into the air, then vanished. Then came the deep, gut-level sound of metal being ripped open from the inside, the noise he had heard before. But this time it rolled through the room like the Panther's last breath. The tank jerked, engine roaring uselessly, then choking out. The gun barrel dipped, almost like a bow, and froze at an odd angle. Black smoke poured from every seam engine deck grills. Vent slits, tiny gaps around the turret. A hatch slammed open on top of the turret. A German crewman lurched half out, jacket smouldering, and a burst of fire from the street below cut him down. The reek of burning rubber, hot oil, and cooked flesh crept through the opening, so thick Miller had to turn his head away for a moment. Inside the room, nobody spoke for a few seconds. Jenkins still had his hands on the tube, as if unwilling to believe the shot was gone. Miller felt a bone-deep ache in his shoulder, his cheek raw from the backblast. He could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the now empty barrel, cooling by degrees. Out in the street, the tracks of the other tanks were clanking backwards, hesitating in front of the burning hulk that now blocked the road and turned that stretch of town into a ready-made kill box. Then the silence shattered. A cheer went up from downstairs, boots hammered on the wooden stairs. Someone slapped his shoulder. Someone else yanked the launcher away to reload. In the middle of the noise, Miller suddenly understood something simple and terrifying. This entire offensive, this entire street, had pivoted on a single pull of a trigger and a shaped charge jet less than a meter long, punching through 8 inches of armor and the thick crust of arrogance around a machine once thought untouchable. And even as the Panther burned, orders were already being shouted, new firing positions, new targets, because that slab of dead steel in the road was about to reshape everything that happened next. The Panther burned hot red like a steel furnace in the narrow street, flames licking up both walls, paint blistering off in big curls. For the first few minutes, the effects were purely mechanical. The tank column behind it slammed on the brakes. The second vehicle tried to squeeze past the wreck, its tracks climbing the twisted metal, slipping, then dropping into a shattered drainage trench and jamming half the hull. The third tank froze right at the bend, turret swinging wildly, throwing shells into dark, empty windows. The German infantry, who had always relied on their armor to clear the way, were suddenly shoved forward as living shields, hugging the walls. sprinting across the street in front of the burning tank to find whoever had fired. Every one of their footsteps sounded loud, because the engine noise was smothered by smoke and glowing metal. For Miller's company, it all unfolded as fast as a starter pistol shot. The lieutenant at the head of the street instantly redrew the battle map in his head. The burning Panther had become an iron gate slammed across the road, turning the German armor behind it into a line of trapped vehicles in a parking lot. Orders snapped over the radio. Bazooka teams, hold your positions. Do not relocate. Machine guns and rifles pour fire into the infantry around the wreck. Another bazooka team on the second floor of a house across the way started hunting a new target, the flank of the tank trying to back up at the corner. Within roughly 15 to 20 minutes, 2 more vehicles were hit. One took a round in the tracks and lay crippled. The other caught a rocket in the side armor and burned sullenly. On paper, that was only a handful of tanks on a single afternoon. At ground level, it was the first time they had seen an armored thrust, stopped mostly by personal weapons, not by 105mm guns, not by bombs from B-26 bombers, but by 2-meter tubes with spiral grooves cut inside. The company's casualties that day were still heavy, some men killed by artillery, others shredded by flying brick and stone. But what everyone talked about later in the dark shelter was a different set of numbers: 3 German tanks knocked out within about 100 meters, and fewer than 20 bazooka rockets fired. For the first time, the trade felt almost fair. On the other side, the shock arrived a few hours later, when reports from the line piled up on the armoured battalion's desk. The dry phrases said it all. Unit lost 3 vehicles attempting to force a small town. Supporting infantry suffered heavy losses in narrow streets. Enemy man-portable anti-tank fire, effective at close range, even against Panther's sloped armour. For many German officers who had dismissed American tubes as fussy toys that rarely hit, this was the first crack in their confidence. They were used to being shelled from afar, bombed from the sky, things that could be shrugged off as bad luck. Now, a nameless soldier in an ordinary house could, with a single shot, turn their 45-ton machine into a cremation chamber. The armoured pride built up from Poland, through France, into the early stages of Barbarossa, suddenly came with a small footnote: avoid tight towns when facing American infantry. Practical reactions came fast. Tank units were ordered not to push deep into built-up areas without infantry sweeping each house. Long, straight streets between rows of buildings were marked on maps as red zones, places where a bazooka could be waiting in any window within 50 to 75 meters. Crews were told to watch rooftops and second-story windows and to use high-explosive fire first to clear suspicious spots before rolling in. What never appeared in written orders, but spread quickly through mess hall stories, was a new feeling. Don't trust the armor anymore. Whenever a tank stopped at a village crossroads, drivers and gunners no longer felt as secure as before. They stared longer at dark windows, imagining any shadow might be someone with a launch tube and rifling inside. On the American side, the psychology flipped the other way. In the rare evenings when the guns went quiet, the story people kept retelling was the moment a bazooka punched through a Panther, the engine cutting out, the iron beast stumbling to a halt in front of a stone house. Training officers, reading the after-action reports, immediately folded those scenes into their lectures. This is what happens when a bazooka crew picks the right angle, keeps its nerve, and trusts the rocket's stable flight. The dry figures from Aberdeen: 7 to 8 inches of penetration, 100% hits at 50 yards once, just chalk on a blackboard, were now tied to names and faces in Miller's company. Faith in physics had been reinforced by the body's own memory: aching shoulders, burned cheeks, the stink of hot rubber. Losses were still losses. The bazooka did not turn war into a fair game. Every German tank left behind usually had to be paid for in the blood of the men who held their ground long enough to fire. But after fights like that little Normandy town, the mental balance shifted a notch. German crews no longer drove into streets with their heads held quite so high. and those skinny soldiers with tubes on their shoulders stopped feeling like they were just chasing after other people's steel. As caution and even fear started to mix with diesel smoke on both sides, a new question emerged. In the long run, how far could a small weapon on an infantryman's shoulder reshape not just a few battlefields, but the very way people designed tanks, planned campaigns, and ran factories far behind the lines? In the thick campaign reports sent back to Washington, the fact that a single bazooka team had stopped an entire armored thrust usually took up only a few lines, buried between shell expenditure tables, engine oil figures, and rations counts. But those little lines quietly nudged the whole axis of how people thought about war. Before the conflict, tanks were designed as kings on the board: heavy armor, big guns, layers of escorts. And very few people took seriously the idea that a lone infantryman with a personal weapon could punish them. After Normandy, Anzio, the Ardennes, and hundreds of nameless towns where rifled bazookas punched through 8 inches of steel, a new column appeared on the tank designer's checklist. How many hits from an infantryman's shaped charge round on his shoulder can this thing survive? Strategically, the most obvious change was that infantry were partly freed from living in their own armor's shadow. Before then, modern maneuver doctrine treated the foot soldier as the runner behind an armored truck. The job was to occupy ground. The guns and armor had already cleaned out. Once rifled, bazookas proved reliable. That picture flipped in certain situations. Infantry with their own anti-tank firepower could hold bridges, choke streets, seal forest trails, turning terrain itself into their armor, while friendly tanks focused on the broader breakthroughs. At corps level, that let American generals spread their armor more flexibly and worry less about abandoning infantry to German tanks. Industrial lessons were just as sharp. The change inside the bazooka tube was a painful but sweet reminder to the factories. Sometimes a tiny detail, those thin spiral grooves, decides 90% of a system's effectiveness. In the post-war years, as the United States developed the M20 with a 3.5-inch warhead and then the M72 LAW, AT4, Dragon, and others, the idea of cost per shot versus kill probability hardened into a key metric. No one would accept a man-portable anti-tank weapon that was 40% luck anymore. The flight path had to be stable. The warhead's geometry had to work as drawn, and the entire production chain existed to serve those requirements, not the other way around. From a cold accounting angle, spending a few $dozen more on each launch tube in exchange for burning a single enemy tank worth tens of thousands of dollars. And its crew was a deal even the plant managers could live with. On the armor side, the reaction turned into a long, slow revolution. Those Scherzen side skirts on Panzers were only the opening move. After the war, as everyone pored over real-world shaped charge results, the old idea that thicker homogeneous armor is always better was replaced by layered armor, sloped plates, composite mixes, and eventually explosive reactive armor, all of it aimed at one thing: disturbing, breaking, or deflecting the penetrating jet, that superplastic lance of metal the bazooka had proved a single soldier could unleash from his shoulder. If, before 1939, you had told people they would one day bolt little explosive boxes all over a tank and deliberately detonate them to spoil an incoming jet, they would have called you as crazy as Mohaupt when he proposed cutting rifling into the launch tube. The long-term consequences went further. Man-portable anti-tank weapons became their own branch, not just an accessory of the artillery arm. Armies from Europe to Asia took the lesson to heart. From the American bazooka, the British Piat, the German Panzerfaust, and later the Soviet RPG-2 and RPG-7, they all shared the same philosophy: give the soldier on the ground a cheap, compact way to threaten any lump of steel that came too close. The combination of a shaped charge warhead and a stable launch system unlocked an entire family of weapons that ran right through the rest of the 20th century, from Vietnam to the Middle East to Afghanistan. Every time an armored vehicle went up in flames because of a shoulder-fired tube, There was a faint echo of that cold morning at Aberdeen in 1943 in the background. In the world of military theory, the rifled bazooka became a textbook case of a technological tipping point, a small, relatively low-cost tweak that forced the enemy to spend many times more to adapt. To counter a launcher that cost only a few $dozen, planners had to think about heavier tanks, thicker armor, more powerful engines, bridges and roads that could carry the extra weight, and fuel logistics swollen to match. In that race, every extra millimeter of steel on a hull was not just mass, it was pressure on the national economy. One obscure engineer had managed to make designers, logisticians, and finance ministers alike pivot around the spiral grooves he cut into a simple steel tube. At a more abstract level, the story seeped into war colleges as a quiet reminder: don't trust surfaces too much. In a century of giant guns and flying bombs, the thing that decides a battle can still be someone stubborn enough to ask, why are we accepting crooked shots, and then refuse to let go until a minor detail gets fixed? And the question that still hangs in the air even today is this: among all the modern weapons systems out there, how many other smooth tubes are we still living with? Simply because nobody has yet been angry or reckless enough to cut rifling into them. Years later, when the war had retreated into history books, a single bazooka sat in a museum display case, a long steel tube with faded green paint and a throat gone dark with age. Visitors walked past, glanced at the little plaque: man-portable anti-tank weapon, caliber 2.3, 6 inches, widely used in World War II. No one mentioned the cold morning at Aberdeen. No one wrote out the full name of the engineer who insisted on cutting those thin spiral grooves inside. To most people it was just an artifact. To the men who had once pressed their cheeks to that metal, every groove had been a chance to stay alive. There is a rather brutal moral argument buried under that steel, between a beautiful production plan on paper and a soldier's body lying in the mud. History almost always sides with whoever dares to change things. Not the person with the highest rank, not the biggest gun, but the one willing to say, we are accepting 15% odds of survival when we could raise it to 97%. And I will take the blame if I am wrong. Cutting, rifling into the tube meant cutting into habit, into the sense of safety of people who only saw the numbers. If no one is willing to make that cut, then every wild shot, every hollow clang off enemy armor, is a cold admission that we are content to send someone else to pay the price for us. The most haunting image is not the burning Panther, but an old man with white hair standing in front of that glass case, staring into the dark throat of the bazooka, and seeing reflected there a young face smeared with mud and sweat from long ago. His generation survived because of a spiral line most of the world never bothered to notice. We live in an age full of other smooth launch tubes, processes, habits, systems everyone knows are crooked, yet chooses to tolerate. If this little story leaves anything with you, let it be this: the next time you are facing some small, annoying, $12 detail, remember that sometimes that is exactly the place where history quietly changes direction.